In June of 2021, a man named Gary Link walked into a Dodge County barn and looked at a woman standing at a workbench and told her, with a genuine kindness in his voice, that what she was doing was a museum hobby. He had a master's degree in vocational education, 22 years of teaching modern shop practice at the County Technical College, and a clipboard with an economic development checklist on it. He was not wrong about many things. He was wrong about this. 2 years later, in April of 2023, a furniture restorer named Margaret Solberg drove down from Minneapolis and stood in that same barn and looked at a Windsor-style side chair that had been built without a single piece of hardware. She held it in both hands, turned it, set it down, and sat in it. She did not say anything for a long time. Then she wrote a check, $4,800. The farm itself, all 160 acres of mixed timber and tillable ground and 3 outbuildings in Dodge County, Wisconsin, had been assessed at $214,000 the month before. 1 chair, 3 weeks to build, $4,800, and Margaret did not negotiate. This is the story of what was in that barn, and where it came from, and what it cost a woman named Ruth Haas to understand that the crate marked scrap in her late grandfather's storage room was not scrap at all. It was an education. And the question I'd ask you to sit with, as you listen to this, is how many times a thing gets mislabeled, not because the labeler is careless, but because they're measuring with the wrong instrument entirely. If you've ever watched someone discount a skill because they couldn't quantify it, leave a thought in the comments. Stay a while. This one takes some time to tell. Ernst Haas arrived in Dodge County, Wisconsin, in the fall of 1947 with a wife, a second-hand pickup truck, $40 American, and a wooden shipping crate that weighed, according to the bill of lading, 231 pounds. The crate held his tools. Everything else could be replaced or earned or borrowed. The tools could not. He had carried them from a workshop in the Rhineland-Palatinate, wrapped in oilcloth and packed in sawdust, and he would carry them through every decade of his life in Wisconsin without ever putting them in a box marked anything other than his own name. He settled 4 miles outside of Mayville, on a piece of ground with a house, a barn, and a stand of white oak that had been established when his grandfather was a boy. He was known in that county for 2 things. He never used a nail where a joint could hold, and he had never, as far as anyone could document, sold a piece of furniture he did not believe in. The pieces came slowly. Ernst was not running a production shop. He built furniture the way a good farmer tends a particular field, with attention calibrated to that specific ground and nothing else. A kitchen table for one family, a set of bedroom chairs for another. He built a church pew that is still in service in St. Mary's in Mayville today. He built a schoolhouse addition in 1958, a wall of floor-to-ceiling bookshelves with hand-cut mortise and tenon framing that has not shifted in 65 years, and that building now survives as the town's historical society. He charged what the work was worth, not what the market said to charge, and the 2 figures were not always the same. People sometimes asked him why he didn't take on larger contracts, why he didn't hire help and run a proper production shop. Ernst was not a loquacious man. He would set his plane down on the bench and look at the person who had asked and say, "A bigger shop makes more pieces. I don't want more pieces. I want better ones." And then he would pick the plane back up, and the conversation was over. His granddaughter Ruth was born in 1987, the child of Ernst's youngest daughter, and she spent summers on the Haas farm from the time she was 6 until she was 12. Those were not idle summers. Ernst put her to work, the way he put everything to work, with a specific task and a clear standard and no particular hurry about getting there. She held Tannen's shoulders steady while he checked them with a tri-square. She swept shavings off the floor while he talked about the difference between white oak and red oak and why it mattered which one you used for a chair leg that would bear weight for 50 years. She learned to identify wood species by smell before she could name them on a test. White oak smelled like a barrel, faintly astringent. Black walnut smelled like something between vanilla and machine oil. Cherry was subtle, sweet, only present at the cut, gone in a minute. She did not understand then what she was learning. She thought she was spending summers with her grandfather. She was, in fact, receiving an education that would not fully arrive until she was 34 years old and standing in a barn with his mallet in her hand. Then her family moved to Milwaukee, and summers stopped, and Ruth grew up, finished college, became an accountant, married, had a daughter of her own named Nora. She thought about Ernst sometimes, but not about the tools. Ernst died in March of 2021, at 91 years old. In the bedroom of the farmhouse, he had never once considered leaving. He had been slowing for 2 years, in the careful way of a man who knows what is happening and has decided that clarity is better than pretense. He had not built anything in the final 18 months. His last piece was a small wall cabinet, cherry and white pine, given to a neighbor's daughter when she turned 21. He had taken 3 weeks to build it. The neighbor had offered to pay. Ernst had said he didn't need the money. Ruth came back to Dodge County in May to help settle the estate. She was the only grandchild who lived close enough to do it, and she was the only one who had spent a significant time on the farm, so it fell to her. She took 2 weeks of personal leave from her accounting firm and drove up from Milwaukee in a week of cold spring rain that turned the county roads soft. The farm had a mournful quiet to it that she had not expected, the way the absence of a particular person reshapes the spaces they had filled. The farm was assessed at $214,000. The county assessor walked through the outbuildings in 40 minutes and noted the contents in broad categories. The barn held some old farm equipment, a pair of sawhorses, a wood-burning stove. The storage shed held shelving, old paint cans, coils of fencing wire, and in the back corner a wooden shipping crate that had been moved at some point, probably when the property was last cleaned out in 2018 and had been relabeled by some well-meaning helper who had looked inside and seen objects coated with a dark, oil-like substance and decided the simplest label was the true one. The helper had taken a wide, flat brush and painted "Scrap" across the top of the crate in black enamel paint, in letters about 3 inches tall. Ruth found it on a Tuesday afternoon. She saw the label and left the crate in place. There was a lot to manage, and she had no way to know yet that the crate was the most valuable thing in the inventory. The estate appraiser put the crate's contents in a line item. It read, "Miscellaneous scrap tools. Assessed value, $0." The county extension office sent a man named Gary Link out in June as part of a rural economic development survey. Gary was 52 years old, tall, trim, with a county lanyard and clean boots, and the particular patient manner of a person who had been teaching adults for long enough that he no longer heard what he expected to be wrong about. He was not unkind. He walked through the barn where Ruth had set up a workspace, and he looked at the workbench, and he looked at the planes and chisels laid out on a canvas roll, and he looked at the wooden mallet Ruth was holding, and he said, in a voice that was genuinely solicitous, "That's a beautiful collection. Is this something you're planning to turn into a business, or is it more of a museum hobby?" He said the words museum hobby, the way a man says something he believes is obvious to both parties. Ruth said the farm wasn't for sale. Gary said he understood that, and asked a few more questions about her plans for the property, checked some boxes, and left. Ruth watched his truck turn onto the county road and stood there for a moment with her grandfather's mallet in her hand. Let me tell you what was in that crate and why the estate appraiser was looking at it with the wrong eyes. Ernst Haas had arrived in Wisconsin in 1947 with 47 hand planes. Not the plastic-handled utility planes that a hardware store sells for $30, but planes that had been built when a plane iron was a serious piece of metallurgy, when the frog that held the iron was machined to tolerances a modern consumer tool does not bother with. There were 6 Stanley Bedrock planes in the crate, made in the first decades of the 20th century, the Bedrock series being Stanley's finest production line before cost-cutting ended it. There were hollow and round planes for shaping moldings by hand, spoke shaves for curved work, a full set of layout tools, a drawer-lock chisel, mortise chisels in 5 widths, a draw knife for rough shaping of leg stock, and sliding bevels for transferring and holding angles. The rust-preventive oil that had alarmed the estate helper was Cosmoline, applied by Ernst himself at the end of every season. The tools were not rusting, they were sleeping. At the bottom of the crate, wrapped in a piece of canvas that had been cut from a feed sack, was a leather field journal. Ernst's handwriting filled it in the German-inflected cursive of his schooling, plain iron angles for different wood species, wood selection notes that distinguished between air-dried and kiln-dried oak and what each was suited for, joint proportion rules that he had derived from years of watching furniture fail and understanding why. On the inside cover, in letters pressed deep enough that you could feel them with your thumb, he had written, "The wood remembers what grew it. Cut with that grain." Ruth read the journal in 3 sessions. By the end of the 3rd, she understood approximately 8% of what it contained. She decided that 8% was enough to begin. A hand plane works by taking a very thin shaving, sometimes as thin as a human hair, from a wood surface. The iron is set at an angle calibrated to the species being worked because different cellular structures respond differently to the cut. Oak wants a steeper angle than pine. Figured maple, where the grain runs in complex waves, wants a higher angle still and a slower feed rate, or it tears. What a hand plane does that a power sander cannot do is compress the wood fibers at the cut rather than abrading them. A sanded surface has been scratched to smoothness. A planed surface has been burnished at the cellular level, and the cells are intact, and the wood holds a finish differently, more deeply, the way a field holds water differently when the soil structure is intact, rather than compacted by machinery. This is not sentiment. This is what happens at the scale of wood fiber, and it matters at the scale of a finished piece. Ruth built her first completed piece in August of 2021, a small side table with a mortise and tenon apron and hand-plane top. She had to remake the top twice. The joints held on the first attempt, which surprised her. There was a line in the journal she had read twice and now understood once. A tight joint does not mean a fast joint. Go slow enough to fit it, and it will last past everyone who doubted you. She set the table in the farmhouse kitchen. Fritz, Ernst's old black Labrador mix, who had moved into Ruth's days as naturally as the barn had, came to sniff the legs and then lay down beside it, and that felt like a verdict of some kind. Nora came to visit in October. She was 16 and had grown up in Milwaukee, in an apartment with furniture from large Scandinavian chain stores, and she was not, she explained to her mother, against the idea of woodworking. But she did want to flag that nobody she knew would buy something that looked this handmade. Ruth asked her what she meant by that. Nora said she meant the joinery was visible. The dovetails showed. Ruth said that was the point of dovetails. Nora looked at the table and said, "Okay, but like, At what price point? It was a fair question. Ruth did not have an answer yet. 4 miles down the county road, a man named Dale Strunk was not asking that question at all, because Dale had done the math in a direction that felt conclusive. Dale was 44, had been running a small cabinet shop out of his property since 2014, and in 2019 he had taken out an $80,000 equipment loan to purchase a CNC router, a laser engraver, and an edge bander. The CNC router alone could produce in an afternoon what a skilled hand tool worker produced in a week. Dale had lined up 3 tract home contractors as primary clients, and in 2020 and into 2021, the residential construction market was running at a pace that made the loan payment feel like a rounding error. Dale's shop was loud and bright and smelled of MDF dust. The equipment was impressive in the way that large, precise machines are impressive, confident, and relentless. Dale could put out a set of kitchen cabinets in 4 days that would pass any builder's inspection and meet any tract home spec. He charged $380 for a dining chair, flat pack, unfinished. The margin wasn't high, but the volume was. When he stopped by Ruth's barn in the fall of 2021 and saw what she was doing, he was not dismissive the way Gary Link had been. He was something quieter than dismissive, which was a kind of pity. He picked up one of the chisels, turned it in his hands, set it down. He looked at the small table. He said Ruth clearly had a gift for it. He said the market for that kind of work was very, very small. He said he hoped she had another income stream. Ruth said she had her accounting practice, part-time, and she was keeping the costs low. Dale nodded as though she had confirmed something he already knew. She finished 3 more pieces before the year was out. A step stool with hand-fitted joints, a wall shelf with a carved bracket, a small blanket chest whose lid fit so precisely it closed with a gentle exhale of air. She was pricing them by the hour, $45 an hour, which felt presumptuous, but was what the journal seemed to suggest by implication. She had 2 buyers. One was a woman from Columbus who had seen the blanket chest at a county craft fair and paid the asking price without commentary. One was a neighbor who had wanted a blanket chest for 30 years and had never found one that felt worth a keeping. Gary Link came back in November to follow up on his survey. He sat at the farmhouse kitchen table with his clipboard and went through the economic development questions again. He looked at the side table Ruth had built. He said it was excellent work. He said the vocational college had a modern woodworking program with state-of-the-art CNC and laser equipment that had placed 43 students in production shop positions the previous year. He said if Ruth was serious about the craft, there were retraining grants available. The hand tool tradition, he said carefully, was beautiful. But sentiment dressed up as skill was still sentiment when it came to making a living. That was November 2021. He believed it. He was not the kind of man who said things he did not believe. Ruth thanked him for the information. She did not apply for the retraining grant. She spent the winter with the journal in the plains. This was not a romantic endeavor. The barn was cold, even with the wood stove going, and the learning was largely a sequence of small failures, each one specific and informative. A sharpening session that left the iron crown, meaning it was higher in the middle than at the edges, which produced a shaving that got thicker toward the center and dropped off at the sides, which told her the problem immediately, but not yet the fix. A setting that was a half-turn too deep, which dug rather than sliced and left a surface that looked wrong and felt wrong and had to be redone. The journal had notes on all of these failure modes, written in the way a man writes things he had learned from repeated error, not with frustration, but with the flat precision of someone who has solved the problem and wants to record the solution before he forgets it. She learned in those months that a plain iron needs to be sharpened to a degree of keenness that a power tool never requires, because a power tool removes material by force and speed, while a hand plane removes material by geometry. The iron bevel has to be correct in angle and in flatness, not approximately correct, but exactly correct. And the back of the iron, the flat face, has to be lapped to a mirror finish before the bevel will sharpen properly. These are not romantic requirements. They are mechanical ones. And the difference between a plane that works and a plane that merely moves across a surface is a difference you can feel before you can see it. A difference in resistance, in the sound of the shaving, in the way the wood responds. Ernst's planes had been sharpened and set by a man who had done it for 40 years. Ruth had to learn what his hands already knew, and she had nothing to learn from but the planes themselves and the record he had left her. Some evenings she sat at the kitchen table with the journal open to a page of notes and read them the way you read a letter from someone who is no longer available to clarify what they meant. The journal was not written for a student. It was written by a craftsman for himself, shorthand in places, assuming a level of knowledge he did not yet have. It was honest, though. It recorded what worked. It recorded on one page in January of 1972 what had failed, a chair leg that cracked along a hidden check because Ernst had not waited the full 4 weeks for the air-dried stock to stabilize. He wrote 3 words: patience is not optional. By February, she could feel the difference between a set iron and a dull one without looking at the surface it had cut. By April, she was not making extra passes. Dale's spring started strong. His 3 contractor clients were building, and the CNC was running double shifts some weeks. He bought a small panel saw with a portion of the cash margin and told Ruth about it with quiet pride when he ran into her at the feed store. Ruth said that sounded like good growth. Dale said sometimes you had to spend to make. She understood the logic. She was not inside it. If you have ever worked wood by hand, you know something that is hard to explain to someone who hasn't. The material tells you things. A hand plane moving across a board surface with a correctly set iron produces a sound that changes when it encounters a figure, a knot, a shift in grain direction, and the change in sound is information. You slow down. You adjust your angle of attack. You read the surface the way a farmer reads a field, not as uniform area to be processed at constant rate, but as a particular system with its own structure that will reward attention and punish the assumption of uniformity. Ernst had written a note about it. The species tells you the season. The individual board tells you the tree. Listen to both. A CNC router listens to neither. It moves across the surface at the rate it was programmed to move, and if there is a figure in the wood that wants a different angle, the router does not know. The surface it produces is consistent. Consistency is a different thing from correctness. The County Vocational Showcase happened in March 2022 in the gymnasium of the Technical College on a Saturday morning with folding tables and fluorescent lights and the specific civic optimism of a room full of people who believe things can be improved. Gary Link had a table near the center with student work samples arranged across a length of cloth, production shop quality cabinet doors with rooted edge profiles, precision CNC cut parts aligned with the tolerances that a modern tract home builder required, and a printed sign listing the job placement rate for his program's graduates. There were other tables, a community garden initiative, a small engine repair program, a woman selling honey from her apiary. Dale Strunk had a table near the back with a sample cabinet door and a brochure for his shop, and he was having a conversation with a contractor when Ruth walked in and I found a folding chair at the edge of the room. Gary gave a short presentation to the small crowd, maybe 60 people, about training opportunities in the modern trades. He was a capable speaker, comfortable with an audience, the kind of man who had given versions of this talk enough times that he could adjust it on the fly. He talked about the regional construction boom. He talked about the job market for skilled tradespeople. And then, toward the end, he said something that was meant to be generous. He said that the hand tool tradition was experiencing a boutique revival among hobbyists and enthusiasts, which was a lovely development for the craft, but that the commercial viability of an approach that could not be scaled or replicated at volume was always going to be limited. He said, not viable at any commercial scale, the way a person says something they consider settled. A fact so obvious it barely requires the words. He was not looking at Ruth when he said it. She was not sure he knew she was there. She drove home and set a new plane iron in the number 5 jack plane and took a shaving off a piece of white oak. The shaving came off in a long curl, translucent at the edges, and she held it up and looked at it against the barn window, and then let it fall to the floor with the others. If you've seen something like that, a skill dismissed in public by someone who had no real frame for it, you already know what that afternoon felt like. If you haven't, I think this story explains it better than I can. Fritz was in the barn doorway, half asleep in the late afternoon light. The spring of 2022 was when things began to change for Dale, though he did not know it yet. One of his 3 contractor clients put a project on hold in April. The client said financing was getting tighter, that interest rates had moved, that the bank wanted a stronger draw schedule before releasing funds. Dale had seen that before, in smaller forms. He was not worried. He had 2 other clients running, and the CNC was fully scheduled into June. He made his loan payment in April and May, on time, and in June he noted in his ledger that the second client had reduced his order volume by 30% without explanation. A call to the contractor's office produced a vague answer about reevaluating the project footprint. Dale marked it as a temporary reduction and kept his equipment running on the remaining work. By August, the picture was clearer and worse. The residential construction market in that part of Wisconsin had hit the first serious contraction it had seen in 5 years, driven by interest rate increases that made the tract home buyers' monthly payment untenable and caused project pipelines to thin almost overnight. The construction market is sensitive to rate changes in the way that a tightly run production shop is sensitive to order volume, with no padding and no alternative absorber. When the orders slow, the overhead remains and the gap opens between revenue and obligation with very little warning. The third contractor, the largest of Dale's 3, shifted his cabinet purchasing in September to a national big-box supplier that had opened a regional distribution center in 2021 and was offering delivery, installation scheduling, and warranty on a price point that Dale's local shop, operating with an $80,000 equipment loan still outstanding, simply could not match on margin. It was not a personal decision. It was an arithmetic one. Dale knew this. It did not make it less damaging. His contract revenue fell 60% between June and October of 2022. He was $14,000 behind on the equipment loan by December. He sold the laser engraver to a shop in Fond du Lac in exchange for a partial payment that caught him up 2 months. He took on lower margin work, cutting parts for other shops at a board-foot rate that covered the building heat and the basic overhead but left nothing for the loan principal. He kept the CNC. The CNC was the operation. Without it, he had only a building. He told Ruth about it at the feed store in January of 2023, in the way a man tells a hard thing plainly because he has already done the grief of it in private and now wants simply to be accurate. Ruth listened. She did not offer analysis. She said she was sorry. She meant it entirely. Dale was not an object lesson in her mind. He was a neighbor who had made a reasonable bet on a reasonable reading of the market at the time it was made, and the market had moved in a direction that his bet could not accommodate. That was not a moral failure. It was the nature of a bet made with borrowed money in a system that rewards speed and punishes hesitation, right up until the moment it punishes speed instead. Her bench, meanwhile, had no equipment debt. Her fixed costs were the barn heat, the sharpening stones she replaced once a year, and the occasional bored foot of carefully selected hardwood. She had no contractor pipeline to lose. She had no volume requirement. She had 14 completed pieces in 2022, priced between $1,400 and $4,100, and 12 of them had sold. Her revenue for the year was $34,200 from 20 hours of work per week, while maintaining her part-time accounting practice. It was not a fortune. It was a living built on nothing a bank could repossess. Nora had been watching from Milwaukee. She came back to the farm at Christmas in 2022 and stayed a week. She asked her mother on the third evening if she could try sharpening one of the chisels. Ruth showed her the stones, showed her the angle, showed her how to feel for the wire edge that forms on the back of the iron as the bevel is worked down. Nora worked it for an hour. She took a shaving off a test piece of pine and held it up and looked at it against the lamp. She said, "That's from just one pass?" Ruth said yes. Nora set the chisel down carefully. The way you set down a thing you have understood is not to be set down carelessly. The journal was on the workbench. Nora picked it up and read the inside cover. Fritz came in from the cold and lay down at Ruth's feet. Margaret Solberg drove down from Minneapolis in April of 2023. She had come at the recommendation of a mutual contact in the antique furniture restoration world, because someone had seen a piece of Ruth's work at a gallery in Madison and mentioned it to someone who knew Margaret. Margaret was in her late 50s, a master furniture restorer and period piece buyer with 30 years of experience in the upper Midwest market. She had handled pieces from the original Stickley workshops, from the early Shaker communities, from immigrant craftsmen whose names appeared on no list. She knew what she was looking at when she looked at joinery. She came into the barn and did not speak for the first several minutes. She moved from piece to piece the way a person moves who is reading, pausing on details, tracing joints with one finger. Ruth stood near the workbench and did not explain anything. Fritz lay in the corner. The barn smelled of linseed oil and white oak shavings. Margaret stopped at the Windsor-style side chair. Ruth had built it in 3 weeks in February. It was made from turned parts of straight-grained ash for the spindles and a hand-carved walnut seat, with a shaped saddle that distributed weight the way a rider knows the saddle is right. The spindles were wedged into the seat and the arm rail without glue. The joints had been fitted so precisely that the wedges, when driven, expanded the tenons into the mortises and would not release in any direction that mattered. There was no hardware. There was no finish except hand-rubbed linseed oil, 4 coats, and beeswax. Margaret picked up the chair and held it at arm's length and sighted down the spindles. She set it down and sat in it. She pressed her palms flat against the arm rail and felt the geometry of it. She sat for a long time. Then she said, "How long to build this one?" Ruth said 3 weeks. Margaret said, "What are you asking for it?" Ruth said she had not priced it yet. Margaret reached into her bag and took out a checkbook. $4,800. She wrote it without a pause and set the check on the workbench and said, "I will not pay more for the freight than the piece is worth, so you will need to help me crate it." She did not negotiate. There was nothing to negotiate. She had looked at the chair and calculated what it was and written what it was worth. The farm had been assessed at $214,000. One chair in 3 weeks, from a barn in Dodge County, $4,800, and the check did not bounce. Ruth looked at the check for a moment. She picked it up and set it face down beside the journal. She said she would get the packing material from the storage shed. The number landed in the county the way a number sometimes does, quietly and then all at once. The Madison Gallery contact told 3 people. Margaret mentioned it in the upper Midwest restoration community, where word traveled in a way that it does among people who have been looking for a specific thing for a long time and suddenly understand it exists. 3 inquiries came in the following month. Ruth filled one. A commission for a small writing cabinet from a collector in Madison who had heard about the Windsor chair and wanted to see what the same hands could do with a carcass piece. She declined one, a production run of 6 chairs for a restaurant, which was a different undertaking than anything she intended to do. She deferred one to the following winter. She raised her hourly rate to $80. Gary Link heard about it through the County Extension Network in May, from the director of the Historical Society, who had heard it from the gallery contact. He called Ruth on a Thursday and asked if he could come out. He drove out in June of 2023, this time without the clipboard. He parked in the same place he had parked in 2021 and walked to the barn and stood in the doorway for a moment before he came in. He stood at the bench and looked at the tools and looked at the pieces on the shelf and did not reach for a label. He said, after a while, that he had been wrong about the commercial ceiling. He said it the way an honest person says they were wrong, plainly, without qualification, without restructuring the error into something smaller than it was. He said he had believed the scale problem was insurmountable, that a craft without volume was a craft without a market, and he wanted to understand what he had missed. He asked Ruth whether she would be willing to have a conversation with some of his advanced students about the hand tool tradition, the ones who had already completed their CNC coursework and were thinking about where to take the work next. Ruth said yes, with the condition that she would demonstrate rather than lecture. He said that was fine. He looked at the bench one more time. He asked where the planes had come from. Ruth told him about Ernst and about the crate and about the label that had been painted on it. Gary stood quiet for a moment and then said, "Someone threw out the education." Ruth said she supposed they had. He drove back toward Mayville in the late afternoon, and Ruth stood at the barn door and watched the dust settle on the county road. She did not feel any particular satisfaction about his correction. He had been wrong in good faith. He was right now in the same faith. That seemed like the best outcome for a person who was genuinely trying to understand the world. What Gary had measured was scale and replication. His instruments were good instruments for measuring those things. A hand tool workshop does not scale. It does not replicate. It produces 14 pieces a year at prices that a CNC shop cannot justify, because the CNC shop is selling a different thing, a product whose value lives in its uniformity. Ruth was not selling uniformity. She was selling the accumulated result of attention paid to a particular piece of wood, a particular set of joints, a particular grain that remembered a particular tree, that could not be measured on a spreadsheet because the spreadsheet had no column for it. Margaret came back in October with a buyer from Chicago who spent 40 minutes in the barn and purchased a writing desk for $6,200. He paid without negotiating, the way Margaret had paid. People who understood what they were looking at did not negotiate because the price was already below what the thing was worth. 3 of Gary's advanced students came out on a Saturday in November and spent the afternoon watching Ruth set plane irons and take shavings. And Ruth explained, in the patient language of demonstration, what the sound of a correct shaving told you, and what the change in sound told you, and what to do when you heard it. 2 of them came back the following spring with boards they had selected themselves and began building their first pieces. One built a wall shelf. One built a small box with hand-cut dovetails. Both took longer than they expected. Both came out better than they expected. That was, Ruth told them, the same thing. Dale rebuilt his operation over 18 months on lower volume and lower debt. He let the CNC do the parts that the CNC did well, and he paid down the equipment loan faster than scheduled by taking on only the work that carried a margin worth taking. He began doing more hand-fitting on the joinery that would be visible and handling, the drawer faces, the door frames, the details that a buyer's hand found first. He did not reinvent himself. He added a dimension to a shop that had been running in one dimension, and the margin on that dimension was better. Ruth sent him a customer once, a family who wanted a set of kitchen cabinets done in a week for a renovation timeline. Dale sent Ruth a customer in return the following spring, a retired professor who wanted a writing table built to last 40 years and had come to Dale first because he did not know where else to go. That was the economy they found between them, and it was a fair one. Nora finished her business degree in 2024 and came back to Dodge County in the spring of 2025. She took over the accounting practice. She also spent her evenings in the barn. By the fall of that year, she had completed her first commission piece, a small cherry side table, dovetail, hand-planed top, joinery fitted so tight it closed with that soft exhale of displaced air that Ruth had first heard in August of 2021. She priced it at $1,800. It sold in 3 weeks. The journal stayed on the workbench between them. They did not discuss who it belonged to because the answer was obvious. It belonged to whoever was ready to read the next page. There is something that happens when a thing gets measured by the wrong instrument. It does not become worthless. It becomes invisible to the people holding that particular gauge. Ernst Haas's tools sat in a crate marked scrap for the weeks between his death and his granddaughter's arrival, not because they had no value, but because the tool used to assess them could not see it. The estate appraiser was using the instrument of commodity replacement cost, which is the right instrument for most things in a barn and the wrong instrument for 47 planes that had been sharpened and calibrated by a man over 40 years of continuous use. Gary Link was using the instrument of scalable commercial viability, which is the right instrument for most trade programs and the wrong instrument for a craft whose value lives in what cannot be scaled. The structural shock that broke Dale's operation did not break Ruth's because her operation was not built from the same materials. Debt and contractor dependency are not moral failures. They are reasonable constructions methods in a world that rewards speed and volume. The world that rewards speed and volume is not, it turns out, a stable world. The world that rewards attention and patience and deep knowledge of a particular material has no dramatic peaks. It also has no dramatic collapses. The wood remembers what grew it, Ernst had written. He meant it technically. He also meant something larger, which is that what a thing is made of is not separate from how it was made, and that a piece of furniture built with attention to those two facts will still be in service long after the person who doubted it is gone. What a market cannot measure, it cannot ruin. Fritz lay at Ruth's feet in the lamplight, and Nora's hands moved across the workbench, and the planes were where they had always been.